The first time they said it, she thought she had misheard. "Be glad we even let you visit." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. 72-year-old Margaret Collins stood frozen on the front porch of her son's expensive house outside Portland, Oregon. A gift bag dangled from her hand. Inside were homemade cookies and a birthday card she had spent nearly an hour choosing for her grandson. The person who said those words wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an enemy. It was her daughter-in-law, and her son stood right beside her, saying nothing. Margaret would never forget that silence, because 18 months later, that silence would cost them everything they thought they were going to inherit. And by the time they realized what she had done, it was far too late. Margaret had spent most of her life sacrificing for other people. Her husband David died when their son Ryan was only 14. One rainy November morning, David left for work and never came home. A drunk driver crossed the center line. Just like that, Margaret became a widow. For years she worked 2 jobs. She cleaned offices before sunrise. She worked at a bookstore during the day. At night she balanced bills at the kitchen table while Ryan slept upstairs. There were months she skipped meals so he could join school trips. Years she wore the same winter coat because new shoes for Ryan mattered more. When Ryan got accepted into college, Margaret cried harder than he did. "You did this, Mom," he told her. "No," she laughed through tears. "You did." But deep down, she knew how much she had given. And she would have done it all again, because that's what mothers do. Years later, Ryan met Ashley. Beautiful, confident, ambitious. At first, Margaret liked her. Ashley seemed driven and intelligent, but little things began appearing. Tiny moments, comments disguised as jokes. "Ryan says you still keep all his childhood trophies. Some mothers have trouble letting go." Margaret laughed politely, but she noticed Ashley always smiled when she said things that hurt. Then Ryan and Ashley got married. Soon came the grandchildren. For a while, everything seemed normal, until Ryan got promoted. Then Ashley's attitude changed completely. The larger their house became, the smaller Margaret seemed to become inside it. Unnightations became less frequent. Pawn calls shorter. Visits awkward. One Christmas, Ashley gave Margaret a framed photo of Ryan, Ashley, and the children. Margaret wasn't in the picture, not even once. "Isn't it beautiful?" Ashley asked. Margaret forced a smile. "It is." But she drove home crying. The message was obvious. You're not part of this anymore. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Margaret called to ask if she could stop by and see the kids. Ashley sighed loudly. "We already have plans. Oh, maybe another day." "You know, Margaret," there was irritation in her voice, "we can't just rearrange our lives every time you want attention." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "I wasn't asking for attention." "Well, it feels like it." That night she sat alone in her house, staring at old photographs. Something was changing, and she could feel it. The next few months became worse. Birthdays forgotten. Texts unanswered, family gatherings where she seemed invisible. Then came her grandson Ethan's 12th birthday. Margaret had spent weeks preparing. She bought the bicycle he wanted, saved money for months, wrapped it carefully. When she arrived at the party, Ashley opened the door with a look of annoyance. "You're early." The party had already started. No one had told her. Children laughed in the backyard. Families gathered around tables. Margaret stood there holding the bicycle. Ryan said 2 o'clock. Ashley shrugged. "We changed it. Nobody called. Nobody informed her. Nobody cared." She stayed only 30 minutes. The entire time Ashley barely acknowledged her existence. As Margaret prepared to leave, she heard Ashley speaking near the kitchen. She wasn't supposed to hear, but she did. Honestly, she acts like she's part of everything. Someone laughed. Then Ashley delivered the line that would haunt her. "Be glad we even let her visit." Silence followed, not because nobody heard, because nobody objected. Margaret looked toward the living room. Ryan stood there. He had heard it too, and he said nothing. She quietly left. No scene, no argument, no tears. At least not until she reached her car. Then she broke. The drive home felt endless. That night she sat in darkness for hours, thinking, remembering, grieving, not for her husband, not for her youth, for her son, because somewhere along the way, she had lost him. 3 weeks later, another surprise arrived. A letter from an attorney. At first, Margaret thought it was a mistake. Then she remembered nearly 20 years earlier, her Aunt Eleanor had purchased hundreds of acres of timberland in Oregon. Nobody paid much attention to it. It sat untouched for decades. But Oregon had changed. Developers had arrived. Land values exploded. And now Eleanor had passed away. Margaret was her sole heir. The inheritance shocked everyone. The land was worth nearly $8 million. $8 million. Margaret sat in disbelief. For days she told nobody. Then somehow Ryan learned. The phone rang. "Mom!" His voice sounded happier than it had in years. Margaret noticed immediately. "Ryan, how are you?" Funny, he hadn't asked that in months. "I'm fine. We should get dinner." "Dinner? Now, after everything?" Margaret agreed, curious. Nothing more. At dinner, Ryan smiled constantly. Ashley acted sweeter than honey. "How have you been?" she asked. Margaret nearly laughed. The performance was astonishing. Then Ryan leaned forward. "You deserve this, Mom." Margaret studied him quietly. Did he even realize what he was doing? Or had greed blinded him completely? For the next few weeks, they called constantly, invited her everywhere, included her in every family event. Suddenly, she mattered again. But Margaret wasn't stupid. She understood exactly why. One evening, she overheard Ashley talking while she thought nobody was listening. When Margaret passes, the property comes to Ryan anyway. Margaret stood outside the room, listening, frozen. Ashley continued. "The kids will be set for life." There it was, the truth. Not love, not family. Money. Only money. That night Margaret made a decision so quiet, so calm, nobody noticed. She contacted her attorney. Then an estate planner, then a financial advisor. For 6 months she said nothing. Meanwhile, Ryan and Ashley continued pretending. Family dinners, holiday invitations, birthday celebrations. Everything suddenly included Grandma. Margaret smiled politely, played her role perfectly, but behind the scenes she was building something neither of them saw coming. The land sold for even more than expected. Almost $10 million after negotiations. The money entered trusts and accounts, legal structures, documents, foundations, carefully designed. One afternoon her attorney asked gently, "Are you certain?" Margaret nodded. "Absolutely. You understand your son receives nothing?" A long silence followed. Then she whispered something heartbreaking. "My son already made his choice." Months passed. Then, one rainy October evening, Margaret suffered a mild heart episode. Nothing life-threatening, but Ryan panicked. Ashley panicked more. Suddenly they visited daily flowers, gifts, concern. Margaret noticed everything. The timing, the fear, the calculations behind their eyes. One afternoon, Ashley sat beside her hospital bed. "You know we love you." Margaret looked at her for several seconds, then smiled. "Do you?" Ashley looked away first. That told Margaret everything. 2 years later, Margaret's health remained stable. She spent her time traveling, volunteering, reading, living. For the first time in decades, she felt free. Then another surprise arrived. She learned that a local shelter for homeless families was closing due to lack of funding. The director explained they might shut down before winter. Margaret drove home thinking about it, thinking about children, mothers, families with nowhere to go. That night she finalized her plans, every last detail. The following summer she hosted a family gathering. Ryan came, Ashley came, the grandchildren came. Everyone smiled, lauded, a perfect family picture, at least on the surface. After dinner, Margaret stood. "I have something important to share." Instantly, Ashley sat straighter. Ryan exchanged a quick glance with her. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. She pulled out a folder. "This contains my final estate plan." Nobody spoke. Ryan looked nervous at this. Ashley looked excited. Margaret continued calmly. "I wanted everyone to hear it directly from me." The room became silent. So silent they could hear the grandfather clock ticking. Then Margaret opened the folder. "I have established scholarships for single parents returning to college." Ryan blinked. Ashley frowned slightly. I have funded housing programs for homeless families. The smile disappeared from Ashley's face. Margaret continued, I have donated significant assets to children's charities through Oregon. Now Ryan looked confused, very confused. Then came the final blow. The remainder of my estate has been placed into permanent trusts supporting those programs. Ashley's face turned pale. Ryan stared, waiting. Surely there was more. Surely their names would appear. Margaret closed the folder. That is all. The silence was devastating. Finally, Ryan spoke. What about us? The room froze. Margaret looked directly at him. What about you? His face reddened. Mom, the inheritance. There it was, out loud finally, not hidden, not disguised, the inheritance. Margaret felt years of pain rise inside her chest. Years of rejection, humiliation, loneliness, heartbreak. Ryan. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Do you remember Ethan's birthday party? Ryan's expression changed. Ashley looked uncomfortable. Mom, do you remember what Ashley said? Nobody answered. Margaret continued. She said I should be grateful you let me visit. Ashley lowered her eyes. And do you remember what you said? Ryan swallowed. Nothing. You said nothing. The room felt heavy, like oxygen had vanished. Margaret stepped closer. For years I begged for scraps of attention. Tears filled her eyes. But the moment money appeared, suddenly I mattered. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. You didn't want me. Her voice cracked. You wanted what I owned. Ashley finally tried. That isn't true. Margaret looked at her, a look that stopped her instantly. Yes, it is. Silence, painful silence. Then Margaret delivered the sentence neither of them would ever forget. I didn't sell your inheritance. Ryan stared, confused. Margaret shook her head. You sold it yourselves. The words landed like thunder. Ryan's eyes filled with tears. Real tears this time. Not because of money, because deep down he knew she was right. Every ignored call, every forgotten birthday, every cruel moment, every silence. He had traded his mother for convenience, and now the bill had arrived. Months later, Ryan tried repairing the relationship. For the first time, sincerely, no lawyers, no discussions about money, no expectations. Just regret, real regret. He wrote letters, apologized. Visited, listened. Sometimes Margaret welcomed him. Sometimes she needed space. Healing wasn't simple. It wasn't quick, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed. Ashley never fully recovered from the humiliation. People eventually learned what happened. The story spread quietly through family circles. Everyone knew. The woman they treated like an unwanted guest had donated nearly $10 million instead of leaving it behind. The shelter stayed open. Families found housing, students earned scholarships, lives changed forever. And every time a child slept safely because of those programs, Margaret smiled, because the wealth she left behind finally went somewhere it was appreciated. Years later, as she sat watching an Oregon sunset paint the sky gold and crimson, she thought about revenge. People imagine revenge as screaming, dieting, hurting. But sometimes revenge is something quieter. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to reward betrayal. Sometimes karma arrives wearing a suit and carrying legal documents. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stop giving their heart to people who only value their wallet. Ryan eventually sat beside her one evening. The silence between them felt different now, healthier. Honest, I was wrong, he said softly. Margaret nodded. I know, I can't change what I did. No. Tears formed in his eyes, but I wish I could. For a long moment neither spoke, then Margaret placed her hand over his. Not because he deserved forgiveness, not because the pain disappeared, but because carrying bitterness forever would only create another tragedy. The inheritance was gone, the money was gone, the future they expected was gone, but something else remained, truth, and truth is far more valuable than wealth. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Ryan finally understood the lesson his mother had spent years trying to teach him. Love is not an investment. Family is not a transaction. And the people who stand beside you when you have nothing are worth infinitely more than anything you could ever inherit. Because in the end, Margaret Collins didn't lose $10 million. She turned it into something meaningful. Ryan and Ashley lost something far greater, the privilege of being trusted by the woman who had once given them everything. And that loss would follow them forever, long after the money was forgotten, long after the headlines faded, long after the documents were signed, because the deepest karma isn't losing an inheritance. It's realizing that the person who loved you most stopped believing you deserved it.